status for the resolution of the pending issues. Yeah.
I am saying that post labor.
Tanaka-san,
You
how
see,
are you? Nice to see you.
It's a technical issue in a sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'd like to start our program this afternoon. Thank you for joining us for this important event, and happy Friday. It's a nice weekend. And so my name is Gi-Wook Shin. I'm director of the Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center here at Stanford University. So on behalf of our center, I'd like to welcome all of you to our discussions today about the recent escalation of tensions between Japan and South Korea. Okay, this is an event co-sponsored by our Japan and Korea program at the center. As you know, Japan and South Korea have enjoyed several decades of growing economic cooperation and deepening social and cultural ties. The two nations hold powerful positions on the international scene, diplomatically and economically, and are critical allies to the United States, a complicated region, facing security concerns such as North Korean nuclear threat and the rising power of China. So both nations also share a number of other challenging issues, such as declining and aging populations. At the same time, there have been tensions over colonial and wartime history. In that sense, recent conflict between Japan and South Korea is nothing new. But in the past, it has been mostly under control since the two nations were understood that it was in their mutual interest to proceed with a cooperative relationship. In other words, history issues were separated from other important economic and security issues. The situation changed rather radically this year, however, with tensions rising to an alarming level. Now, tensions over history have spilled over into economic and security issues in the midst of rising nationalism in both countries. The current situation is generating some cause for concern, especially as leaders from both countries appear unable to find a diplomatic solution. Eyes have also turned to the U.S. involvement in this issue, as the U.S. is not only an ally to both countries, but as it was a key player in the region's unresolved past. But the U.S. willingness and ability to step in and mediate is still in question. So today's discussions will shed light into the many critical questions surrounding the current conflict and the future political landscape in the region. Should we recognize today's conflict as an aberration or a pattern of cycles? It's a global trend of nationalism, including what we see in the United States. It's a new force driving the current and possibly the future conflict. What is the role of international environment, especially role of the United States? And how should we understand and expect the consequence of this conflict to affect international affairs and trade between Japan and South Korea, and also internationally? Okay, these are some of the pressing questions that we'll try to address today's discussion. So we have excellent panels of experts in front of you today. The first half, we will discuss on diplomatic and international relations. And then second one, we'll focus on the trade and economic issues. So I look forward to very constructive discussions today. And hopefully you can enjoy also our conversation throughout the two panels. So once again, welcome and thank you very much. So let me now turn to Kenji Kushida, who will moderate the first panel. Yeah.
Hello and welcome. I'm Kenji Kushida. I'm a research scholar at the Japan program in the Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center. We have in front of you very deep expertise, so deep that if I were to read each of their profiles, we'd use up the time. So you do have detailed bios here. I will only refer to them by their names and then first the title. As important as is the depth of knowledge, as importantly, their current positions are neutral. So we don't have to have any posturing or any official declaration of any country's stance. So this is also very important for a free discourse. So with that, I'd like to first turn to, we'll go just along as the program, and each of them will speak 15 to 20 minutes, and then we will have a discussion. Ambassador Shin Kak-Soo, who is the former Korean ambassador to Japan. If you could get us started, please. Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, let me thank APARC for inviting me to this August gathering, which deals with one of the very thorny issues in our region, that is Korea-Japan diplomatic fray, which has been continued almost 7 years. So let me start by saying where the Korea-Japan relations stand now. We can identify several prominent features of the current ongoing dispute between Seoul and Tokyo. As you know, since Korea-Japan established diplomatic relations in 1965, both countries have encountered several crises, roughly saying 6 to 7 crises during the 54 years. But the depths and seriousness of current crisis is unprecedented in the sense that as I mentioned, it has been going on for 7 years, and it spreads all over the areas between the two countries. So especially the recent rising tension between Seoul and Tokyo is what I say a kind of race for stupid stuffs between Seoul and Tokyo. Recently, Japan took trade regulation over strategic goods exported to Korea. And the Korean government also took action to terminate GSOMIA. It's an agreement to protect military information exchange between the two countries. These two measures are the result of the fray between Seoul and Tokyo regarding the forced labor issue, which was triggered by the Korean Supreme Court's ruling on that issue last October. So it's a kind of a chain reaction, action and reaction, and it just pushed the relations at this nadir during the 5-decade-old bilateral relationship. And this is a kind of multiple complex fracture because it is quite long and the causes are quite various. I just described the current crisis a multiple complex fracture. It means that the prescription to this crisis is hard to make. The second feature of the current crisis is the increase of emotional response by each government to what's happening between the neighboring states. For instance, from the latter half of last year, we have witnessed many events that would have not take place if the bilateral relationship were good. Last September, the Japanese maritime self-defense just canceled its visit to Jeju. Korean Navy hosted the Jeju International Fleet Review in 2018 because the Korean side asked the Japanese maritime defense, self-defense to not to hoist so-called the rising sun flag. But the funny thing is that in the past two events, Japanese warships attended that event in 1998 and 2008. 20 years later, it was denied, and then the visit was canceled. So it's quite abnormal. And the Korean government also decided to dissolve the Reconciliation and Healing Foundation, which is the essence of the Accord on the wartime sex slave, which was concluded in 2015. It means that the Korean government neutralized that accord despite its pledge to maintain that accord. And then there was an incident between Korean warship and Japanese patrol plane in East Sea, Sea of Japan in Japanese terms. And this is quite serious military activities. Of course, the Korean Navy denied such activities by Korean warship, but Japan just pursued this issue at the level of Prime Minister's office. Usually it was to be handled at the technical level between the two navies, but that was not the case. So there are many other cases which came from emotional response from Seoul and Tokyo. So it's quite unusual. And the third feature might be the resurgence of historic related issues in bilateral ties and the change of positions between Korea and Japan regarding the past related issues. In the past, of course, we have had many diplomatic troubles coming from past related issues. But for the last 5 decades, we have settled many issues, and then it was supposed that the issues of unfortunate past might be being settled down. But as I mentioned, the issue of so-called sex slave, as well as the issue of forced labor, it just came up to dominate the bilateral ties between Seoul and Tokyo. And one more thing is that in the past, Korea was offensive on that issue. But after the resurgence of these two pending issues, Japan is on the offensive. Just leveled the high moral ground held by Korea in the past. So quite reversed. And the fourth feature is deepening mutual distrust between Koreans and Japanese. We can witness rising anti-Korean mood in Tokyo, while the anti-Japanese atmosphere in Seoul is also rising. So mutual distrust between the Koreans and Japanese are quite being aggravated. And this is really lamentable in the sense that in Northeast Asia, there are two triangles in terms of strategic environment. Northern Triangle composed of North Korea, China, and Russia. And the Southern Triangle, South Korea, Japan, and the United States. But the relationship among the three southern countries are being weakened, while the Northern Triangle is getting closer and closer recently. So the souring Korea-Japan relations is a big blow to the maintenance of Southern Triangle to cope with the volatile security environment in Northeast Asia. And the fifth feature of the current crisis is the concern over the fixation of the vicious circle as a new normal between Korea and Japan. As I mentioned, it has been dragged on for almost 7 years, and there is no outlook for just restoring the ties as of now. So I think that the deterioration of the public opinion in the two countries are undermining the foundation of the bilateral relationship between Seoul and Tokyo. Last but not least, the South diplomatic relations is spreading over economic and security areas. There has been a firewall between politics and economy in Seoul-Tokyo relations, but that firewall has been collapsed following the introduction by the Japanese government of trade regulation against strategic goods exported to Korea. And the decision by the Korean government to terminate Gisomia is also reflecting the weakening foundation for mutual trust that is essential for maintaining security cooperation between Korea and Japan. So all in all, the current situation is quite serious. Is unprecedented in half a century old Korea-Japan relations. So there are many causes that brought such a fracture between Korea and Japan. I'll just enumerate several structural or non-structural reasons behind such fractures. First, the change of generation in both societies is one of the prime reasons that causes such frictions. In both societies, post-war generation has become the mainstream of each society. So post-war generation has not enough knowledge about what happened during the colonial rule and Second World War. So their attitude toward past history has become changed. Secondly, the economic gaps between Seoul and Tokyo has been narrowed down, and for instance, per capita income in terms of purchasing power parity has been equal between Seoul and Tokyo nowadays. When they established the diplomatic ties in 1965, Japan's per capita income was 9 times as large as Korea's. So you can imagine how the relative strength between the two countries has been changed. And another reason is just a combination of Japan's historical revisionism and post-democratization Korea's questioning the legitimacy of past authoritarian regimes' legacy. As you know, Korea got through authoritarian rule for almost 2 decades, and it was succeeded in democratizing itself in 1987. So after that, in Korea, there are many judicial rulings that just negate what had been done during the authoritarian rule. It has been also applied to the Japanese colonial rule, and 2 prominent rulings by the Constitutional Court and the Supreme Court, one for so-called comfort women, another for the forced labor issue, were prominent in the sense. And different perception of law and justice between Korea and Japan is also affecting the way they handle past-related issues. Japan is very strict in just complying with laws and regulations as a legacy of modernization. but in Korea, as I mentioned, they have got through a lot of tumultuous era, and in Korea, the Koreans tend to consider what they perceive as injustice should not be cannot be ignored or cannot be rectified. That's the difference between Korea and Japan regarding legal culture. And another source of friction is not a source, but another source of just aggravating the fray between Seoul and Tokyo is the fraying of communication channel between Seoul and Tokyo. In the past, the political circle, as well as many friendship associations, were instrumental in bridging the gap between Korea and Japan, but not nowadays. Rather, the political circle becomes a burden for the bilateral ties, might be thanks to populism, quite prominent in both Korea and Japan. And finally, the wrong combination of political leaders, I mean Korea and Japan, might be another reason for the current diplomatic tension. As you know, Korean President Moon is representing the liberal camp in the Korean society, while Prime Minister Abe is just on the back of the right wing, very conservative right wing camps in Japan. And one more thing is that in the past, both foreign ministries in Seoul and Tokyo were quite active in resolving the disputes between the two countries. But nowadays, Blue House in Korea, as well as the Prime Minister's office in Japan, are main players in the field of diplomacy and security affairs. So that's just affecting the things between the two countries in a negative way. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. Next, Mr. Hitoshi Tanaka, Chairman of the Institute of International Strategy at the Japan Research Institute and a former Consul General here in San Francisco. Welcome you back to Stanford.
Thank you. I feel very, very nostalgic about being here because I was Consul General, as Ms. Kushida talked about, Consul General from 1998, 2 years. As a Japanese, I feel also nostalgic about San Francisco because we all remember that it was San Francisco where the Japanese first delegation after Meiji, after the beginning of Meiji, came, and San Francisco was the initial place to visit. Iwakura Tomomi, his delegation sort of expecting to make the visit of 2 months, but ended up with 2 years. The Iwakura Tomomi's mission learned about modernization in the United States, and they decided to go to Europe and spent 2 whole years. And that delegation was comprised of about half of the cabinet at that time. So it was very, very impressive, isn't it? And again, Japan fought 2 wars since then, in 40 years period, since this delegation's visit to the United States and Europe. Japan-China War and Japan-Russia War, both of which Japan successfully defeated those cases. But yet, remember again, the reason for Japanese war with those countries to do with Korea, because Japan thought that Korea was so important for Japan, Japanese security. And both China and Korea, I'm sorry, China and Russia, were expanding their influence over the peninsula. That's the reason why Japan fought very serious war with China and Russia, in a sense, successfully. By going through that, Japan created lots of sufferings on Korean peninsula, no doubt about it. But yet, at the same time, we should remember that how important it is for Japan to maintain this strong connection to Korean peninsula. Having said that, let me add to what Ambassador Kak-Soo talked about. I have no disagreement to what he said. Basically, I think the current situation, Japan-Korea relationship is at its worst since the normalization of the relationship of 1965. There are a couple of reasons for this. I think basically, I do believe that those reasons are kind of, how shall I say, rational in a sense. Couple of reasons. First, the importance of the 2 nations to each other has declined. In the past, Korea thought the relationship with Japan was one of the most important relationships for Korea. But as time goes by, in terms of economic relationship, China emerged as the largest trade partner for Korea by far. Japan became 3rd important economic partner for Korea, and I think this tendency will grow in the future as well. Security-wise, the United States is a security guarantor for Korea. Japan may not be counted much in relation to the importance of Korean security. So for Korea, Japan is getting less important. In the eyes of Japanese, the same thing applies. Economically, China is by far the largest trade market for Japan. United States since the end of the war, United States was the security guarantor. Therefore, and again, one other reason why Japan considered South Korea as not so important to Japan, that is a question of the governance of South Korea. We had a strong sort of enthusiasm when Korea turned into democracy in 1987. Yes, now Korea is one of the democracy in the region, strong democracy in the region. Now Korea is a good partner for Japan in terms of the, democratic traditions, because we know in Asia there are not very many democratic nations. Therefore, Korea was considered as one of the strong comrades for Japan in terms of the values of democracy. But yet, as time goes by, Japan was finding Korea not so democratic. I don't have to pick up every incident for that, but yet Korea doesn't follow international law, the bilateral agreements, and also sort of thing. So that is one of the reasons why Japan started considering Korea is not that important for Japan. That is one reason. Second reason, each nation doesn't understand the depth of the public sentiment toward each other. I was talking to my girl, my daughter, who is now 39 years old, and I was talking about this Japan-Korea relationship. I mean, these days, all the TV talks about the question of Japan-Korea, and Japanese TV was very, very critical to Korea. And I was telling to my daughter that we should face up with what we have done in the past. And I talked about the past 500 years. 500 years. Why? Because Toyotomi Hideyoshi in the 16th century sent 150,000 soldiers to Korea and fought on the peninsula for about 6 years. It's like Bush sending troops to Iraq. The same thing. So it has did create a huge, huge sacrifices on Korean Peninsula. And I was, in a straightforward way, I was talking to my daughter that we should not forget about this. She was mad, simply mad to me. She stopped talking to me. She says, it is irrelevant, she says. What is important is today, South Korea is doing something which is not very reasonable. They are, not honoring the 1965 basic agreements. South Korea is not fulfilling the promises made by the government in relation to comfort women. That counts most. Since then, I stopped talking to my daughter. But yet, that is something. There is a gap. It may be the generational gap. The people in Japan would not like to see the Japanese sort of damage which Japan created on Korea. They feel that since relationship is important, relationship should be more important into the future than in the past. But Korean people, it's not just Japan. It was a long history in which Korea was suffering from the pressure from external countries like China, Russia, and Japan. And in the case of Japan, Japan ruled Korea in a direct way, colonized Korea for 36 years. Therefore, that's the reason why South Korea has got very strong anti-Japanese feeling, and it is, in a sense, understandable. So this is sort of the gap existing between two countries in terms of public perceptions to each other. The third reason for this, if you look at the current governments, both, in Korea and in Japan, Korea is very, very liberal nation. They make pro-North Korea policies. Japan, on the other hand, is a conservative government. And Prime Minister Abe came to the scene of the prime ministership, saying that we shall get rid of the remnant of the post-war period. In particular, the question of history. Why should we be so apologizing and all sorts of things? So Japan undoubtedly become very nationalistic. And I don't think it is a wrong thing. Japanese clearly is very, very proud of the nation. But yet, as you know, Japan had to go through all this, what we call lost decades, 20 years, 30 years, and Korea has risen. China has risen more. Therefore, there's every reason why Japan is more nationalistic. When I negotiated with North Korea, I spent 1 whole year negotiating with North Korea secretly. And when the Prime Minister, as a result of my secret negotiation, Prime Minister went to North Korea, and at the end of the day, we got 5 abductees back to Japan, and in the garage of my house, there was a time bomb placed that Mr. Tanaka, who negotiated with North Korea, a rotten government, he deserves accepting time bomb. Incredible, isn't it? The then governor of Tokyo, Ishihara Shintaro, stated that Tanaka Hitoshi is worthy of receiving time bomb. Crazy, isn't it? But anyway, this is an occasion when we open up the burst of what we call national sentiment. Japan is much more self-assertive. Japan, for the first time, became the nation who were attacked by someone. Japan was in the past low-key. Japan was the one who created sufferings at the rest of the nation. Now Japan was the nation who received damage from North Korea, and that was the start of Japan becoming very, very assertive and all that. So what I'm talking about, let us understand very natural kind of transition of public sentiment, both in Korea and in Japan. One other reason why the relationship gets so much is the question of North Korea. When we have similar North Korean policy, we see eye to eye. When I was doing Asia Pacific as Director General, we took a dialogue policy vis-a-vis North Korea. Prime Minister went to North Korea. The Kim Dae-jun, the President of Korea, very, very welcome the Japanese policy. But today, you have a kind of different government. The South Korean government is much more pro-North Korean policy. Japanese Prime Minister Abe is much more critical to the way North Korea handles external affairs. Therefore, this is one of the reasons why the relationship is not very good at this juncture. Now, let me talk about future, because future is more important than today. I think only when we think that future relationship is important and future relationship, it is too pity to spoil future relationship due to the question of history. I mean, everywhere in Europe, the countries feel that the current relationship is important and future relationship is more important. Therefore, let us make accommodations regarding the question of the past. So unless we feel that future relationship is essential for both of us, there is no way for us to address those questions. Let me talk about why our relationship into the future would be important. First, security. I was in charge of contingency planning in 1994 in the Japanese Foreign Ministry. At that time, North Korea declared a war in the event the UN agreed upon economic sanctions. Therefore, we started preparation for a possible war. And we feel that there are 30,000 troops, US troops on Korean Peninsula. No way, US cannot cope with the contingency situation only, alongside with US-Korea security treaty. Only when you have triangular relationship, Japan, Korea, Japan, United States security arrangement and United States-Korea security arrangement, we can fight. We can deter North Korea to come to us. And I did that precise planning with my counterpart in Pentagon. And it's amazing to see a huge number of US planes, huge number of US attack planes. They're not going to Korea, coming to Japan for the sake of protecting South Korea. And every bit of real logistical support are to be taken place in Japan. Korea indeed will be a battlefield, but yet all the logistical support would have to be done from Japan based upon US-Japan Security Treaty. And GSOMIA is just one of them. I mean, how can you? I mean, I will say to Korean government, if you think that you still wish to deter North Korea to be aggressive, you would have to be prepared for the possible contingency. Can you do that without Japan? No. So the political relationship, the security relationship is so important. Second, let's talk about economic relations. You find out how strong, deep interdependency we have between Japan and South Korea. Samsung, the deputy head of Samsung, while this deterioration was peak, he went to Japan. Why did he go to Japan? Because we all know that there is a very deep interdependent relationship. All those big South Korean companies are export companies. Korea make money out of exporting all this, high-techs, automobiles. Who finances? Who finances? Do you think that Korean government can get the sufficient amount of hard currency? No. It's Japanese mega bank who is supporting South Korea to be very, very, profitable export companies. And Japanese banks are making money as well. This is the kind of interdependent relationship, and we are near. I mean, it's amazing that we have 25% out of 30 million people. Every year we have about 30 million people coming, tourists. Out of 30 million people, 25% are from Korea, 25% from China. So we are very much dependent on Korean tourists, for the consumption market in Japan as well. Politically, this is an important thing for the future. What world can you imagine, say, 20 years, 30 years from now? China would be probably the largest nation in terms of GDP. At least Xi Jinping talks 2049, 100 years since the inauguration of the nation, to be the largest, strongest socialist company on the earth. And probably they will surpass United States in terms of GDP, much earlier probably. And look at the United States. US under Trump is very, very different from United States in the past. United States is very, very willing to undermine the leadership they have provided for the sake of international liberal community. He doesn't care about losing that leadership. And think about this. In East Asia, you have very, very strong still rising China. China has got problems, but yet rising China with expanding military capability. And you have declining United States, only in relative terms, but very clearly, in my mind, United States will undermining will undermine their leadership. We feel very, very vulnerable. We feel very, very vulnerable. What to do? We need to create lots of partnerships with various countries. It could be India, it could Australia, but it must be Korea, Japan and Korea. So let us be realistic. I say to Korean people, let us be realistic. Japan needs to be facing up the past, because it's not just the 36 years of direct, colonization. It was a long period of time. Japan has created lots of sufferings on them. Let's see it. But yet, I'm not keep on apologizing. What we need to be doing is to cherish the future relationship so that we both, Japan and Korea, will be much, much happier than today. I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We've heard from our Korean friend, our Japanese friend, and our US friend. So therefore, I'm going to call him Joe, who's been former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Korea and Japan and the former Special Representative on North Korea.
Well, thank you very much, Kenji, and thanks to Professor Shin for bringing us. It is a real honor to be on the stage with such distinguished diplomats as Tanaka-san and Ambassador Shin. So thank you very much. It's also great to see my former colleague, Bob King, Ambassador Bob King. Thank you for coming. As a diplomat, one of my biggest mentors was Ambassador Steve Bosworth. And he once said to me, this was in middle of negotiations, there is no solution that optimizes both parties, but you have to make compromise. And in compromise, yes, you can take one step back, but you also take 2 steps forward. So that's the rule of thumb, whenever you take a step back, you gotta go 2 steps forward. And this reminds me, I completely agree with Tanaka-san and Ambassador Shin that the current relations, both South Korea and Japan, are running backwards, not even taking any steps forwards. So this is a real dilemma. I started working at the State Department in 1985. My last job was to look at both Japan and South Korea, as well as North Korea. And I started in Obama administration and continued with Trump administration. I left just about a year ago. I completely agree. This is the worst that Japan-South Korea relations have been for as long as I can remember, and I'm glad Tanaka-san, who has a lot more history than me, agrees with that. And I wanted to pick up where Tanaka-san left off. That's the role of the United States. And, my impression, and we've seen Ambassador Shin and DG Tanaka go into reasons why this is such a deeply rooted problem. It is a problem. Honestly, I don't believe there is a solution, but rather it's a problem of management, that we need to manage the problem, because, otherwise you're just going to fall off the cliff, and we're very near falling off the cliff. So right now you have seen both sides racing to the bottom, and they're doing it for purely political, their own political goals, for their own political ends, their own domestic popularity, and really no concern, as you've seen both our speakers say, for the national concern. And in this, conspicuously absent has been the United States. What they are eroding is the trilateral security arrangement that the United States has had in Northeast Asia since the end of the Second World War. And you can say, I think you can make a very strong argument that this arrangement, this alliance arrangement, has been responsible for prosperity, not just in Korea and Japan, but also in China and rest of Asia too. I don't think there is any doubt that without security underwritten by United States, this would not be happening. So we need to ask, why is it happening now? And I do believe large part of that blame goes to the United States. I have no doubt that when South Korea was thinking about pulling out of GSOMIA, it would have only taken a phone call from Trump to Moon to stop it. And this would have happened in the past. It would have taken one phone call for Trump to tell President Moon, quit, stop doing what you're doing. But he didn't make the call. And we have to ask ourselves, why is that the case? Why didn't it happen? And I believe it has more to do with the situation within the US administration than possibly anything else. And I believe South Koreans know that. I believe the Japanese know that. I mean, in fact, before South Korea suspended GSOMIA, South Koreans did not even notify, or they did not even consult with the United States, but rather 2-3 hours before picked up the phone and said, okay, we've decided to suspend GSOMIA. This thing, could not have happened, I believe, under any administration. And I do blame it on the Trump administration, and you can see their record, their non-commitment to alliance relationship throughout the past few years. When candidate Trump spoke about alliances, he made no secret of the fact he didn't have the commitment, that US was spending far too much, our allies had to share the burden, and that in the end, he was willing to pull the troops out, withdraw the troops out. Well, I thought that was usual political rhetoric. But I think even when he first went into the office, he was completely determined to follow that roadmap. And I think we very much underestimated him. In fact, one of the first things when I came across, I was still in office at the time, was when Korea-US FTA was being negotiated. And even at that time, that was very early in the administration, I think middle of 2017 or spring of 2017, even at that time, he was threatening to pull US troops out of Korea and for the trade end. And then this continued. And right now, I think we have the most challenging aspect of the alliance, in which the US side is asking for 5 times the amount in what we call host nation support. So US side is asking what Korea used to pay, which is $1 billion a year, $5 billion. I mean, that is completely outrageous. And for Japan, I think Japan pays about 1.5 billion. Tanaka-san, they're asking 7.5 billion, And again, I think I've talked to my colleagues in Korea and Japan who are in office. They simply don't know what to do with such demand. I mean, on the one hand, you can say, well, maybe it's an opening position, but then maybe not. Because today we saw a press statement from State Department essentially spelling out pre-negotiations, what these negotiations are all about. This again is an unprecedented step between allies to go public with that kind of position. So I'm very, very disturbed by it. So in the absence of United States, I do believe both President Moon and Prime Minister Abe kind of had a free rein in doing what they want, doing what they desire, kind of taking out on what they've kind of wanted all along. Yes, I mean, it is, I do believe issues like North Korea divide them. I do believe there are other issues that divide them. But fundamentally, this is not a problem that can be managed without strong framework and offer of mediation from the United States. I remember when I was back in the government, we took a very active role, both in GSOMIA negotiations and Comfort Women Agreement. And you can say whatever you want, that some agreement were bad, some agreement was better, but this was all an attempt to look at the equities of 3 countries. And without a strong role from the US, I'm very pessimistic that this that we can really reverse the situation. So Kenji, why don't we leave it there and see, you know, I have a lot of questions for these guys too. You know, okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. It's almost a mirror image of the public discourse in the diplomacy, where it's not your fault. No, it's your fault, and then don't care. No, we have problems. You have problems. No, it's us. Yeah. We have problems. And so this is wonderful. And I think, as you started off, mostly in panels like this, I'm most interested in what each of you would like to ask each other, because I think that that's what the rest of us often want to hear too. And I think before we go there, one of the underlying sort of narratives that all of us are trying to understand is there were trajectories of this relationship, and things changed, and then the relationship has gone sour? Or what was it underlying already there that just kept on going but became more extreme that led on the trajectory? And your partial answer to that was the US changed. And so it's not us, it's you, or it's not you, it's me, this kind of relationship issue. But as we think about these things, I think as we pile on the different facets, the different types of analysis, let's all think about the underlying trajectories, and partly in search for what can be done next, and that's what I'd ask you later. But first, let's ask you to ask each other what you'd like to hear.
I do want to ask, Tanaka-san. I once talked to an Israeli diplomat, and I asked them, comparing Israel's situation, what happened in the war, and I said, how did you guys get over what happened in the Second World War, And his answer was actually fairly straightforward. He said Israel got sick and tired of Germans apologizing, and so they had to tell them, okay, stop it now. We can move forward, So I wanted to ask Tanaka-san whether something like that is ever a possibility.
Well, meaning that Japan continued to make apologies so that Korea fed up with the numbers of apologies Japan makes. Well, let me put it this way. The question of history was an issue for Korea and China, but yet it was also an issue in Japan because there was a unique situation where, let's look at Germany. Germany put their, the responsibility of the war to Nazis. And Nazis was responsible for making all the atrocities. And Germany created a fund saying that anyone who were harmed by Nazis come forward. We shall pay the individual payment made. In the case of Japan, we had San Francisco Peace Treaty. Here again. And we had Japan didn't have any sovereign right at that time. It was US. Everything was dictated by the United States. And in that agreement, they talked about responsibilities. And the Far Eastern Court, they picked up Class A war citizens. They were executed. And someone asked, what about the Japanese emperor? Because every Japanese soldiers, when they were dying, called for emperor, emperor, banzai. Therefore, under normal circumstances, it wasn't very strange if we thought that emperor was responsible for all the Japanese atrocities and all sort of thing. But the history demonstrated it wasn't the case. The United States clearly made a decision that what is important for Japan, for the world as a whole, is to quickly quick recover of Japan to be strong part of what we call the West, to confront with the Soviet Union. So US thought that remaining, to see the emperor as a head of Japan would help Japan to quickly rebuild its country. It was lucky to us as well. Therefore, we are not like Germans. German can say Nazis. So we followed the kind of common wisdom meaning that in 1995, I was directly responsible for it. I wanted to create the basic document in which all the ministers, cabinet ministers can follow. That basic document was Murayama Danwa, Murayama Declaration. Murayama was a socialist, but yet we thought this is a right opportunity for us to create all Japan apology. And in that Murayama statement, we have very clear apology. And it said that Japan introduced a wrong public policy and created huge loss to the countries in Asia. We are sorry for that. We shall put more emphasis on education, blah, blah, blah. So Murayama, that was it. So if we were sticking to all this document, that could have been fine. But people forget. People forget. And, that's probably the reason why, it appears that we are not making any apologies. But we indeed are making apologies, in authentic apologies. There's a need for authenticity as well. I mean, it doesn't make sense if I say, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. It must have been the authentic, the government document, which is Murayama statement.
I'd like to add something to what Mr. Tanaka mentioned about the history issue between Korea and Japan. Yes, it is true that the debate persistent debate about the past history between Korea and Japan has brought up a kind of fatigue in the Japanese society that is now turning into a kind of Korea fatigue syndrome in the Japanese society, just fanning out anti-Korean mood there. In a sense, it is right that Korea has opened up the past-related issues again and again. But on the other hand, since the inauguration of the Abe government, what the Japanese government pledged to make a contrition and apology for what they did during the Japanese colonial rule and Second World War had been just challenged there. And that's why Korean people are very upset and angry that the Japanese side is just pulling the goalpost out, while the Japanese criticize that Korea is moving the goalpost. Yeah. So I think this kind of very useless, in a sense, useless exchange of criticism against each other should be stopped. And we need to just start a serious process of historical reconciliation between Koreans and Japanese. It would take a lot of time up to the satisfactory level, but we have to do that. And in that process, Korea and Japan must approach the pending issues in a cooperative manner and with the spirit of tolerance on the part of victims and genuine apology on the part of perpetrators. In that process, it is important for us to share the same historical education and research as both Germany and Poland did for almost 80 years. It is a long process, but we have to do that, and otherwise we cannot place our bilateral ties on the stable foundation. So, of course, we have to resolve the pending issues relating to the unfortunate past, namely the so-called comfort women issue as well as the forced labor issue. But between the two peoples, we have to just get our hearts closer through the historical reconciliation. Then might be a great boost for a stable and sound bilateral ties between Korea and Japan.
Great. I'd like to synthesize a few hypotheses that came out here because I think they're very much worth writing down and thinking about. So one came out of Mr. Tanaka's comments, and so that was fascinating, which is Japan and South Korea tend to agree when they agree about North Korea. Right? If they're both aligned in that dimension, everything else is likely to fall into place. And I'm sure you worked in all sorts of closed room negotiations that you can never tell us about in order to get Prime Minister of Japan to North Korea and then bring back people that North Korea had denied existed and all of this. So if we look throughout history, it might be worth looking at that. How do you align? And so is it structurally an issue where if they don't align on that, we have to watch out for everything else? Another interesting hypothesis or question that comes out is, well, of course, the discussion just now, how much apology is enough? How much is enough to be considered genuine? How much is enough to be considered enough genuine and remembered? What are some mechanisms there? And given that there are differences with the German case, and we're in sort of different enough that you can't do the same things, what would work? And a third one would be, so is the case that since both sides are democracies at this point, and you can always score domestic political points by jabbing at each other, is this a structural situation where we have two parties that are bound by the wrists so they can jab at each other? Because actually, are they really going to go to a war? Well, probably not. So then how far can you go? And it's quite alarming how far they have gone, partly because the one that's binding them at the wrists together, the US, seems not interested or even goading them on to do things. So that's another way to look at it. We have about 7 or 8 minutes before you formulate your questions and ask them the most difficult questions you can think of. So I'd like to, as you prepare your questions, I'd like to ask if you have any other comments given your discussion just now, or anything that I raised that you'd like to address.
Thank you. Those are, you formulated them very well. I mean, let me just have a stab at the North Korean question. And certainly, you know, both North Korea and South Korea, that's the fundamental problem, feels that Japan has no role, should have no role in inter-Korean or Korean Peninsula issues. So the idea that somehow Seoul and Tokyo should coordinate policy on North Korea is completely anathema to South Korea and Japan. I would say even some Koreans are now beginning to feel that, you know, that U.S. should not have much of a role, but again, that's granted because of the U.S. troop presence, denuclearization issues, and so on. But I think there is a fundamental agreement within South Korea, and whenever I talk to the North Koreans, they completely agree that on policy issues, denuclearization issues, normalization issues, sanctions issues, they see no role for Japan. I think that's a problem.
May I?
Yeah, yeah, please, go ahead.
This is an interesting question. Think sort of hypothetically, Japan probably would not like to risk the situation where United Korea have nuclear weapon. Japan would not like to see a situation where Korea has much, much stronger influence by China, meaning that if Korean Peninsula is united based upon North Korean orientation, we shall be opposed very significantly. Third, if the Korean Peninsula is to be united in a soft way, based upon democratic rules, the respect of human rights, and all sorts of things, Japan will make utmost support for the realization of that. The fourth point, Japan is obliged to make huge economic cooperation available in the event of normalization of the relationship with North Korea, even in the event of unification of Korean Peninsula with the South Korean lead. So Japan has a very, very clear position in relation to the Korean Peninsula. As I said, if you look back, Japanese behavior might not be sort of well commended, but yet Japan has got a huge security interest in Korean Peninsula. Only when you have the countries, like in six-party format, countries who have stakes in the security of Korean Peninsula, if those countries were in the decision-making body, the region will be stabilized. Japan needs to be there. Japan cannot be outside. I have some complaint about the current attitude on the part of the Japanese government. Japanese government talks as if there were only one issue, like abduction. I think Japan needs to be making a full-fledged cooperation in relation to all aspects of denuclearization process. And again, by definition, Japan needs to be there in order to create a roadmap for the North Korean denuclearization, because no roadmap today is talking about the denuclearization alongside with the establishment of peace regime. Peace regime obviously include such things like normalization. It's not just normalization with the United States, it must be normalization with Japan as well. And the establishment of the peace regime talks about the softening of sanctions and all sorts of things. Therefore, I am very much hoping that the United States do pay due consideration although Trump talks about bilateralism, I think this issue needs to be handled in a regional and multilateral way. And six-party talks will be almost the right format for doing that. That needs to be remembered. Otherwise, any agreement will become very, very fragile. The second question, the question of keeping apologies. And if we did not apologize, there might be a war, you said. I think, I mean, Ambassador Shingansu talked about the endless process of the history study. I'm afraid that there is not going to be a real accord in relation to the interpretation of the history, because Japan was the one who created sufferings. Korea is the one who received that suffering. Therefore, it would be extremely difficult for us to. We had done it once. The U.S., Korea, and Japan established history commission, and they discussed about it. But yet, we came up with a conclusion that there is no possibility whatsoever to have the common, consensus view in relation to the interpretation of certain history. Therefore, we have to be a little bit more adult-like attitude, meaning that, as I said, only when we consider that future relationship is so important, let us not spoil. That is probably the only way with which we can push to the future.
Well, just regarding the issue of North Korea, I think that there must be room for Japan's role in addressing the North Korean nuclear issue as well as the North Korean question as a whole. As Mr. Tanaka mentioned, but the problem is that the South relationship between Seoul and Tokyo prevented them from having close strategic dialogue. It has been stopped almost 7 years. The issue of the North Korean nuclear issue is at a crossroad, very important timing, but it's lamentable that both Seoul and Tokyo do not have enough strategic dialogue on how to proceed with the negotiations on the North Korean nuclear issue. Even though the United States is negotiating with North Korea, but both Korea and Japan can work together not to let the United States make a deal with North Korea to the detriment of the common interest of both Seoul and Tokyo. We are concerned that a partial deal with North Korea might open the way for North Korea becoming a de facto or nuclear armed state in the end. So we have the common interest to stop such a deal from Washington. And on the other issues relating to North Korean opening up and reform, and as well as economic development, in the process of resolving the North Korean nuclear issue, as well as the Korean reunification. So I think what matters for us is to just resume our strategic dialogue, just before our relations had been soured 7 years before. And regarding the apology, I don't think Koreans ask the Japanese to keep apologizing to the Japanese. What we are asking the Japanese to address the past history is that just to let Japanese young generation remember what they did during the Japanese colonial rule and the Second World War, just lest such unfortunate things happen again in the future. But that is not the case currently. So that's why I emphasize the importance of history education and research on unfortunate past.
I agree to what Ambassador said, but yet at the same time, as a diplomat, I must say that South Korea must let younger people know how helpful Japan was since the end of the war, and in particular during the period of great leap of South Korea under President Park, and also although it was military government, but Japan was made a tremendous cooperation to the establishment of automobile industry, the steel industry, and also things. It's amazing. I often go to museum in South Korea during the period of great leap helped by Japan, missing. So all those young people don't know what Japan did. Therefore, I agree that we should let Japanese youngsters to know more about the history. But yet, I hope that Korea would let Korean people know about the help Japan rendered.
Yes, I fully agree with what Mr. Tanaka said. Yes, whenever I was invited to lectures or seminars on Korea-Japan relations in Korea, I called for the audience to reflect on what Japan did after normalization for the economic development of Korea. I think balance should be struck between the past, present, and future in addressing our bilateral relationship. Otherwise, we lose what we can gain from such a balanced approach.
Wonderful. So we'd like to open it to the floor. And I think someone's going to ask the magic wand question. So I'd like the panel to prepare, if you'd like, the magic wand being, what are some concrete, specific steps that if you had a magic wand could be done tomorrow if you were able to impose what you think should happen to each of the governments, or it could be people to people, as you alluded to. Everybody go find your Korean or Japanese friend and maybe first apologize, talk about history, and then become friends and build it up, whatever it may be. But that's the magic wand question, and I'd like to circle to that at the end. What would be the concrete steps that you'd like to do? I'm going to collect a whole bunch of questions, and then the panel can, unless you specifically address it, answer any question they want to. And make sure it's a question, and your question should be under about a minute. So yes, Dan.
Dan Snyder from FSI. This is a bit of a magic wand question, but I am interested also in sort of how do we back our way out of this. And by the way, I really appreciate the rational discourse that's taken place this afternoon. And since I read a lot of what's in the Japanese and Korean media, I know that that's in short supply these days. So there are two routes out of this that people have talked about, and I'm not sure why, Ambassador Shin, you referred to 7 years as your point of departure, but The other point of departure in terms of deterioration of relations is the, as you referred to, is the decision of the Moon administration to basically dismantle the Comfort Women Agreement, which took place 3 years ago or 4 years ago, and was actually a positive development, I think, in terms of beginning to manage these problems, and could have been an interesting model for dealing with the forced labor compensation issues. So is there any chance to, one, to resurrect the Comfort Women Agreement? And obviously that's something that the Moon administration or a Korean administration would have to do. And two, is it possible for the Korean government to finally agree to the proposal from the Japanese side to handle the forced labor issues within the structure of the 1965 treaty and the arbitration process, which is laid out there very clearly for when you reach a dispute over precisely this kind of thing? It seems to me those are two ways to begin to move backwards, and I agree, obviously that puts a little greater pressure on the Korean side, but it seems to me those are, you can't avoid those issues. And by the way, I worry about the impending decisions of the Korean courts on asset seizure, because that will then make things even more difficult. So I guess the third point is there a way to hold that off while you go through this process of arbitration?
In the middle? Yeah.
I'm just a private citizen. I don't know much about the politics, but I regularly visit Japan and Korea. 20 years ago, I thought Japan had a lot of great stuff, but I stopped going there since 5 years ago because so much hatred toward the Koreans. I mean, books, medias, and I'm thinking about, is it because of a Korean government, some government broke the judgment? I don't know about but I don't think that's it. I think there's so much, 3 words I can say. It's jealousy. Jealousy. It's jealousy. The Korean current, the young cultures dominating Asian over everything. You know that. And why, I mean, Japan cannot address that and reinventing yourself to be better? And it's all about jealousy. I think you guys are just jealous. That's what it is. Come on.
Let's rephrase that as a
You
question.
used
Is
to
it
be better.
jealousy?
You used to be
Great.
better. You used to be, model citizen in Japan. I mean, in Asia. I admire that. That's why I went there to learn, all lecturing stuff, a lot of cool stuff to learn. Now, it's so depressing. People always talk about Korea did that, Korea did that. But if I go Korea, they don't talk much about Japanese. We talk about, only the media talk about it. But if you keep keep doing that, you're not going to advance. It's like Silicon Valley terms, you're like a HP, and Korea is like Google. You're going to disappear sooner or later. You got to reinvent. That's how I see it as a private, as a citizen point of view. I don't know about politics.
In the back here?
I'm short, less than 1 minute. In 2001, the currency swap exchange between Korea and Japan is $2 billion. By the time it ended in 2011, officially ended in 2015, of 2011 is about $17 billion, which is really huge because South Korea have huge dependency on Japanese raw synthetic material for semiconductor manufacturing, which is a large import. And now the whole thing stopped. And this $100 million is substantial. Do you think in the near term that they will ever get back to talking again, or not going to happen for at least years from now?
Thanks. I'm Captain Chris Sharman. I'm a National Security Affairs Fellow at Hoover Institute. I'd like to focus specifically on some national security affairs issues. First being, one thing I did not hear mentioned was Dokdo or Liancourt Rock. I'd like to hear your perspective. We've talked about a trajectory that we're on, which is a very negative trajectory. What is the potential, real-world potential, of conflict over this disputed island? Secondly, associated with that, we've talked about the suspension of Josomia. In the real-world case that North Korea is to launch Taepodong 2 over Japan again, which is inevitable at some point, is there any room for information sharing between the two nations with this Gisomia in suspension? Thank you.
Well, let's collect these final two and then we'll circle around.
I guess this is a form of a question because I've attended dozens of Shorenstein Center events, and in none of these events I disagreed with many of the proposals and analyses. Was it such I don't know how to describe it, but to just sort of conclude your presentations with an attack on President Trump is just insane. President Trump is not responsible for this. In fact, you, who were an Obama appointee, are the guy who took the point in attacking Trump. So this is, to me, a kind of, I'm disappointed in the Shorenstein Institute. I definitely am.
Is there a question in there?
Yeah, why the hell do you do that kind of thing?
Last up.
Sorry.
Thank you. My name is Ned Nierge. I'm with the Schiller Institute, one of the international organizations founded by Lyndon and Helga Zepp-LaRouche. Number one, thank you, each of you, for speaking. Shin, if I may address you so, I very much appreciate your entire presentation. Hitoshi, your comments regarding the history and the apologies. And so thank you. Last statement on the thank you. Now to the question. There's an imperial history which mankind has lived under, and there is recently a nation state. The imperial history has been presented on the stage. The imperial history, we find, is finally, potentially, being put into the history books, and the nation state, dedicated to the welfare, general welfare, not a financial welfare, but how are the people living and collaborating with each other for their own mutual future. The common aims of mankind.
Is there a question? Sorry.
Yes. The common aims of mankind do exist, whether they're Asian, European, or any other location on the planet, any gender. Towards that end, the future must be directed, and I have hope that some of you have shifted and can begin to recognize the imperial aspect from the nation-state aspect. Would you please expand on your vision for the future for 7.5 billion people, please? Thank you.
Thank you. So we have a lot to potentially address, and anybody can address any question that they'd like in any order.
May I?
Yes, please.
Snyder's question, I think we must recognize that there is a difference between the question of comfort women and the forced labor issue. With respect to 1965 Basic Treaty, 1965, at the beginning, the negotiators of the two nations wanted to pick up all the specific cases of claims, each other. Japan put up this Rishoban line, all this Japanese asset left in Korea, and also Korea came up with big list of claims. There was no question of comfort women, because at that time, the question of comfort women had not been known. But there was a very, very clear claim regarding the forced labor. And after all this very severe negotiation for 10 years, they came up to the conclusion that let's lump lump sum settlement is required. Therefore, Japan paid $500 million. That was about 3 times as big as Korean budget at that time. That was the settlement in 1965. The question of comfort women, the Japanese government put up 10 yen. How much is it? The certain amount of money for the public entity, because of the fact that although it was Korea needs to take care of that, but the Japanese government have moral obligation to do that. That's the reason why they put the money in there. But this Choyoko forced labor issue, that, as I said, that was clearly under the term of the 65 agreement. Therefore, we say that it was a responsibility of the Korean government, because it was meant that Korean government will pay all this money to those former forced labor people. So that kind of basic rule still needs to be respected. We say that the judgment made by the Supreme Court of Korea may not be intervened because there is an independence there. And we do acknowledge that there's still the individual claim to be done. But yet all the court, in Japanese court and other courts, turned it down because of the fact that country to country, there was a solution. So very streamlined here in order to find out the right solution. It would have to be a very, very slim line. The Korean government appears to be considering various ways to satisfy that requirement, meaning that Korean government must be, in principle, responsible for providing resources to those people. But at the same time, they feel that there is some type of devices in that. We would like to wait what responses Korean government would come. I have the feeling that there must be a way. There must be a way. And again, the time left for this is very short because, as you say, if Korea were to seize the asset, to make it cash, then that is the end of the story. I'm sure there is going to be a very, very severe response from Japan that will trigger further worsening of the relationship between the two. I wouldn't like to see it. And November 23, this is the official expiration time for GSOMIA. The Korean Prime Minister is coming on the 22nd of April. Therefore, I would very much hope that, in October. So this one month, October 22nd to November 23rd, that is an opportunity for us to be able to settle things. This shitto type thing, jealousy type thing. You are wrong. You are wrong. We love in Korean pop culture. I think those young old ladies still loving all this Korean TV movies and all sorts of things. And Korean love Japanese pop thing. Korean love the Japanese manga and all sorts of things. I don't see there's any jealousy or something in relation to the cultural exchange and all sorts of things. I like all these young Korean dancers and pop singers. I don't know why. We must be the same sort of Asians, but yet they are much smarter than Japanese. No jealousy whatsoever. Possible conflict on Takeshima, yes, it is. It is going to be, because it depends upon the environment to be developed from now on. And we all of the time feel that there may be an accidental conflict without much intention to a full-fledged war. There might be a very, very accidental confrontation surrounding Takeshima. And if that were to happen, I'm sure given the hot public sentiment, there may be further worsening, very, very sharp confrontational situation to arise. We would like to avoid that as well. What else? Would it be possible for us, without Gi-Somia, would it be possible for us to exchange information? In the past, when I was active in the Japanese Foreign Ministry, we had lots of crises surrounding North Korea. All the time, information was cut between Japan and Korea. And when Japanese self-defense force airplane scrambled, we let Americans know. America communicated to South Korea. And that, I think, most probably, that is going to be the case. And Korea refuses to get direct information direct from Japan because of the very strong anti-feeling for that. Therefore, this sort of framework, Gi-Somia framework, is essential. Without it, I don't think there is any reasonable exchange of secret information. The question of Trump, you must be responding to it, but yet don't mistake us, because I mean, what I feel very strong is this is a question we, Japan and Korea, bilaterally settle. We need to settle that. But yet, the question of security, United States has treaty with Japan, United States has treaty with Korea. United States has a legitimate interest in maintaining trilateral cooperation because the issue of the day is a question of North Korea. And I don't think United States is to be criticized by not, I mean, I have a sufficient reason to criticize the United States because the United States does not show any interest in sort of facilitating some type of trilateral cooperation, because I'm not saying that United States coming to talk to both Japan and Korea. United States needs to be there because United States are party. So there must be a legitimate reason why United States should be mindful of the trilateral cooperation.
So we have about -2 minutes for each of you to give us. So if each of you could
Be real quick.
to give each of your last thoughts in -1 minute each.
I very much agree with Tanaka-san on virtually everything. I want to highlight that, as he said, 2 dates coming up: November 23rd, Gi-Somia, and December date for the asset seizure. So the first rule of diplomacy is, when you're in trouble, stop digging. So you have to stop further retaliation. And that's what I call freeze for freeze. You can have, so you have to stop retaliation, and that's got to be the first agreement. And I also agree with Gi-Somia. It is critically important. It is important for practical exchange, as well as it is a political document on 2 countries to cooperate on security. I very much appreciate your question on President Trump. I am not partisan one way or the other. It's just a reflection of his abrogation of responsibilities.
Well, I'm the last speaker. Yeah, I want to be very brief. Regarding the question raised by Dan, yes, I think the 2 issues need to be handled together just to resolve the past-related issues between Seoul and Tokyo once and for all. And I don't think the judicialization of this highly diplomatic issue is desirable by just referring this issue to arbitration under the 1965 agreement. When a Korean government just asked the Japanese government to bring the comfort woman issue to the arbitration, the Japanese side declined, vice versa, on this issue. And yes, I fully agree with two speakers that there are two inflection points about the ongoing diplomatic crisis between Korea and Japan, and that is the expiring date of Jisomiya, November 22nd, and maybe the end of this year or the beginning of next year will be very important in the sense that the sequestered asset of Japanese companies might be liquidated. So we have to just provide some room for diplomatic negotiation between Korea and Japan, and in that sense, the visit by Prime Minister Lee Na-kyun to Tokyo next week might be a good opportunity to create such favorable environment for diplomatic negotiation. And we are also having two multilateral fora that provide the two leaders of Korea and Japan with an opportunity to meet each other. So we have to make full use of this diplomatic encounter to just stop deteriorating further. And yes, it is true that anti-Korean hatred is very popular nowadays in the Japanese society. But that's not out of jealousy, but it is out of commercial journalism in Japan. Well, it is true that when TV station just add some program related to Korea, it can increase almost 60 to 70% increase in watching TV, that program. It is reported in the Japanese media. So is the Japanese, especially weekly journals. They are very just fanning out interest or attention from the Japanese public about Korea in the negative way. And regarding the currency swap, of course, we need such a swap revived, given the volatile financial situation all around the world. And Dokdo, it is a catch-22 situation, and it's not easily resolved. So we have to manage to prevent such an accidental encounter between Korea and Japan, as reported to by Mr. Tanaka. About Jisomiya, I fully agree with Mr. Ambassador Yoon that we need to keep Jisomiya to maintain the trilateral security cooperation to cope with North Korean nuclear threat, as well as the volatile strategic environment in Northeast Asia. Thank you.
Please join us in thanking our panelists. Thank you. And we'll be back in 5 minutes. No, 3:05. We will be back at 3:05 for the next panel.